the apocalypse. When an entire people are destroyed or destroy themselves. The end of civilization. For us today, as we go about our daily lives, it's barely something we consider. We're so sure it couldn't happen to us. But for some civilizations, it already has. The Bible. It's one of the most influential texts ever written. For millennia, it shaped the lives of billions of people. It holds stories of great civilizations, miraculous events, the Word of God. Many people see them as parables for how to live their lives. But for some, these stories are historical truth. Of all the events the Bible details, one remains shocking, even today: the destruction of Sodom. According to the Bible, Sodom was one of the 5 cities of the plain. It was remarkable for its wickedness.
The tradition is that the sin of Sodom was what the Bible describes to be sexual perversity, specifically homosexuality.
But is this really true? In the Bible story, God appeared before Abraham and told him his plan to destroy Sodom and the cities of the plain. For Abraham, it's a shocking revelation. His nephew Lot lived in Sodom.
According to the Bible, Lot and his family were different than the other people living in Sodom. They would be considered righteous people.
Abraham pleaded with God not to destroy the innocent and guilty without distinction. God assured Abraham that he would spare the city if just 10 decent people could be found there, and devised a test of Sodom's hospitality to strangers.
The Bible says specifically that the sin of Sodom was arrogance, gluttony, and apathy, and specifically that they were not kind to the poor and the needy, that it was inhospitality, this general unkindness towards other people that made Sodom an evil city.
God sends 2 angels disguised as travelers to meet with Lot, who takes them in and treats them well. Lot passes God's hospitality test. But when the news of the foreigners' arrival spreads through Sodom, the city descends on Lot's house and demands he hands them over.
Immediately, all the neighbors are banging on the door saying, "Send out these 2 men so that we may know them." And in biblical terms, that usually means to sleep with them. Lot says, "Absolutely not. You can have my daughters instead. They're virgins. You can do whatever you want with them, but you cannot have my guests." At that point, God steps in and says, "No, the test has failed."
It's damning. The angels allow Lot and his family to leave, but when they are gone, God levels the city with the remaining inhabitants inside.
It would have been positively terrifying.
God destroyed them in a shower of fire and brimstone, so terrible that no man could live in this land.
The destruction was so complete that the city was abandoned for 700 years. It's a profound punishment for the city's perceived sins.
God sends these 2 angels down to Sodom and the cities of the plain to test their hospitality, to see would they be welcomed, and they failed that test. So it's less a story about sexuality, and it's more a story about hospitality. Hospitality was so important in the ancient world.
Only after the rise of Christianity, in the first few centuries CE, did its interpretation change. Early Christian theologians shifted the story's focus away from offering hospitality to create a morality tale condemning homosexuality. But does the story of destruction hold any truth? We ask the question, did the city of Sodom actually exist? And could it be possible to locate its ruins? According to the ancient writings of the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah, Sodom was supposedly part of what's known as the 5 cities of the plain. They were situated in southern Canaan, a large region covering modern-day Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. Of the 5 cities, Sodom was the largest, and thus the epicenter of the plain. For centuries, archaeologists have tried to locate it.
I think everybody loves a good lost city story, whether it's Atlantis or Sodom. There's this treasure hunter aspect to it. There's a confirming mythology, a way of confirming the historicity of oral tradition.
But if the story of Sodom is more than just a myth, like some believe, where did it take place? And how could archaeologists locate it? Renowned biblical archaeologists Dr. Thomas Sharp and Walter Rast carry out surveys of Bab-edh-Drah. It is an ancient site southeast of the Dead Sea.
Thomas Schaub and Walter Rast were actually very well-respected archaeologists and academics in the field, and both had a keen interest in biblical archaeology and historical geography. Schaub was actually a priest, and Walter Rast actually led many expeditions to the Dead Sea.
As the two break ground, they discover 4 more sites nearby: Numaira, Safi, Pfeiffer, and Kanazir. For Schaub and Rast, the number of sites could be a crucial indicator for whether Bab-edh-Drah is Sodom.
The Bible says that Sodom was one of 5 cities of the plain. And if 4 other cities were discovered near Bab-edh-Drah, it increases the likelihood that Bab-edh-Drah is the city of Sodom.
The discovery of these 5 ancient sites in close proximity to each other is key. And through excavations at Bab-edh-Drah, the archaeologists date the site to around 3300 BCE.
This is significant because some people think this is when the city of Sodom existed too.
And during excavations, the team unearthed evidence that not only was Bab-edh-Drah the largest of the 5 sites, but it was also once the location of a thriving community.
There were fortification walls around the town. Archaeologists were able to identify people's houses, workshops. It would have been a place of some significance.
For Schaub and Rast, it's looking more and more likely that Bab-edh-Drah is Sodom. And when the archaeologists examine the site more closely, they make a crucial discovery. There is evidence of widespread destruction.
The archaeologists discovered piles of collapsed mud bricks and also large piles of ash and charcoal, and the town walls had been destroyed by fire.
At the second site, Numaira, Schaub and Rast make similar findings. But most astonishingly, archaeologists find the skeletons of several people.
The bodies were buried under all of this burnt debris. So these were people who had died and been crushed while they were still either fresh corpses or while they were still alive.
Some experts believe that Schaub and Rast's findings match the biblical description of the destruction of Sodom through fire and brimstone.
There's one camp who think that Bab-edh-Drah and Numaira are evidence of destruction from an earthquake and catastrophic fires, that we found our target.
The claim that the southern site of Bab-edh-Drah could be the former city of Sodom becomes known as the Southern Theory. But had biblical Sodom finally been uncovered? Over the years, new evidence has emerged which casts doubt on the theory.
When excavations were carried out at the other 3 sites, Archaeologists found that there were no occupational structures. What they had found was a bunch of cemeteries. This is a place where people buried their dead.
And radiocarbon dating of the two largest sites, Bab-edh-Ra and Numeira, cast further doubt on the southern theory.
These two cities were destroyed 2.5 centuries apart from one another. That's 250 years in between the destruction of Bab-edh-Ra and Numeira.
To match the biblical description, these sites should all have been destroyed at the same time.
They don't fit the time. So, yeah, to me, it's 2 strikes and you're out. You don't need a 3rd strike.
The southern theory just does not hold water.
Did Sodom ever exist? If so, was it at all possible to find? In 1996, archaeologist Dr. Stephen Collins takes up the challenge. Having grown up in a Christian household, he has long been fascinated with the relationship between the Bible and scientific evidence.
I had sort of worlds in collision going on in my head, and it was hard to justify science and faith and belief together.
Joining Dr. Collins in the search for Sodom is Dr. Philip Sylvia, an electrical engineer by trade. In more recent years, he's turned his focus to the Bible and archaeology.
I think Sodom is the epitome in Scripture of God's judgment against sin in the world. And it's the engineer in me. And the theologian in me understands there must be a discoverable trail of physical evidence showing us what he did and how he did it. And that's what drives me.
The more Dr. Collins studied, the more convinced he became that the Bible could provide clues to the location of Sodom.
And so when I look at the historical record, when I look at the biblical record, and it squares with reality, it squares with science, it squares with archaeology, and I can't find any way to overturn it, then what am I supposed to do?
For Dr. Collins, the realization that Sodom and the cities of the plain may not be south of the Dead Sea came about by accident in 1996. That summer, he is leading a tour of the Holy Land sites. While planning an expedition to Bab-edh-Ra and Numeira, he rereads the story of Sodom. Something is amiss. In the Bible, before Lot moves to Sodom, he and his uncle Abraham bid farewell to each other. At this time, the Bible places them somewhere between the settlements of Bethel and Ai, northwest of the Dead Sea. From there, they can see the whole plain of Jordan.
The Bible says Lot looked over, saw the well-watered plain of the Jordan, and went eastward and pitched his tent as far as Sodom.
According to the southern theory, Sodom is southeast of the Dead Sea, 80 kilometers from Bethel and Ai. But if Abraham and Lot were in the north at Bethel and Ai, they wouldn't have been able to see that far.
I got to the end of it, and I thought to myself, I don't see anything in there that would locate Sodom toward the south, but everything would locate it north and east of the Dead Sea. How in the world could serious scholars be putting Sodom toward the south into the Dead Sea? Because if they're reading the same text I'm reading, why aren't we seeing the same things?
Collins digs deeper into the ancient text. His focus turns to identifying the correct location for the plain of Jordan.
Genesis 13:10 says that Lot saw the plain of Jordan and that it was well watered, like the garden of the Lord. So if you can find the plain of Jordan, you can find Sodom.
After meticulous studying, Collins finds a clue to the whereabouts of the plain of Jordan. In the Hebrew language, the word for plain is kikah, which means round.
In a case of land, it would be a round, flat area of arable land. That is where we should be looking for Sodom and the cities of the plain.
Some archaeologists believe that the only area in Jordan that has a flat circular plain that is well watered is north of the Dead Sea.
If you are looking at a very good topographical map, you'll see a circular area, a kikar, north of the Dead Sea.
But for some, using the Bible as a geographical source should be approached with caution.
We need to be cautious with how we use the Bible texts. We have to keep in mind that if this event happened, it was another 1,000 years before it was written down. And then since being written down, it's passed through 5, 6, 7 different languages before it comes to us. So to put too much weight on one word is a bit hazardous. If we treat Sodom and the cities of the plain as a crime scene, then the Bible is one source. We also have archaeological evidence. We have ancient maps. So we have to actually look at the whole thing like a puzzle, and each piece has to be put together to really grasp what happened there.
Proponents of this new northern theory are convinced somewhere in this circular plain could lie the biblical city of Sodom. Further evidence may lie in the oldest surviving map of biblical sites, the Mardaba map. It dates from the 6th century CE and is located in the Byzantine Church of St. George in Mardaba, Jordan.
Now, we have to understand that the Byzantine period was the biggest Holy Land tourist industry ever in history. And so this map was on the floor of this church for the singular purpose of showing people where to go.
The map is incomplete, but crucially, it features a key name, Zoar. Along with Sodom, the Bible lists it as one of the 5 cities of the plain.
Zoar is significant because it was the only city of the plain that wasn't destroyed. And it wasn't destroyed, according to the Bible, because it was the city to where Lot and his family escaped.
The map doesn't feature Sodom, but it does feature something else north of the Dead Sea. Partially intact depictions of 2 cities. For Dr. Collins, they're key geographical markers.
I have a sneaking suspicion that those 2 representations of cities on the north end of the Dead Sea are Sodom and Gomorrah.
But if the missing piece of the map is Sodom, where exactly is it? In 2005, Collins and his colleagues head to Jordan in search of hard evidence.
And that was a little bit scary at first because I couldn't find any map of archaeological sites done by anyone in America or Europe or Israel, and it really bothered me. I said, what am I going to find when I get over there?
But then, at the American Center of Oriental Research, a breakthrough. As the team pore over maps and surveys, they come across a book, The Antiquities of the Jordan Rift Valley. In it is a map showing ancient sites in the Kikar region of Jordan, northeast of the Dead Sea. The team put boots on the ground and begin a process of elimination, hoping to identify the most likely site for Sodom.
And what did we find? 14 major archaeological sites. Well, here was the problem. I was only looking for 4 or 5 sites. Now I had 14. Some seemed to be too small, too insignificant, or the wrong period, and so we eliminated them.
After a week of surveying, only one candidate remained, Tal el-Hammam. It's situated 13 kilometers northeast of the Dead Sea.
The Bible had told me that Sodom should be the biggest Bronze Age city on the northeast side of the Dead Sea. And guess what? It was just absolutely huge. How in the world had people not put this on their radar? Why was it not on any map?
After almost a decade of research, Tal el-Hammam is Collins' prime suspect for Sodom.
I was walking down on the top of Tal el-Hammam, and I grabbed a handful of that sand and sort of let it run down through my fingers. And I said, Someday, you're going to tell me what you know.
But to reveal the truth behind this ancient site, he needs to start digging. On the 27th of December 2005, the team begin the excavation. Initial findings reveal a colossal site, spanning an area of approximately 150 acres. It's much larger than any other Bronze Age site in the region.
I was surprised, I think, mostly the sheer size of the site. To me, it was just a wow moment.
With the site larger than anyone had anticipated, Collins recruits world-renowned archaeological architect Dr. Lean Rittmeyer to map the site.
I got a phone call from Dr. Steve Collins. He said, would you like to come to Jordan and see my new excavations? I believe I found Sodom. I said, Sodom? You must be daft. It is quite impossible. He said, just come and have a look. I said, okay, I'll come and have a look. The site and the architecture impressed me very much. And so I was really interested in the site from an archaeological point of view.
During the first few seasons of excavations, the team unearthed fortified walls 5 meters thick and up to 12 meters high. They also find a palace, a temple, and at least 2 plazas, and dozens of houses and streets, all dating to the Middle Bronze Age period when Sodom is believed to have existed.
The Middle Bronze Age fortifications were stunning to me. We estimated the rampart system itself took somewhere between 40 and 60 million mud bricks to make. It was obviously a highly centralized government who could put such a project together and complete it.
I've worked on many archaeological excavations. I've never seen such a huge site. The el-Hammam is about 6 times as big as the old city of Jerusalem.
Crucially, the team discover layers of ash throughout, ranging from 0.5 meter to 2 meters thick. Evidence that Tal el-Hammam was destroyed. And they're convinced it was destroyed in the Middle Bronze Age.
Mixed in with that ash are pieces of pottery that we can identify with that Middle Bronze Age date.
The evidence indicates the site was burnt in 1700 BCE. And as Dr. Sylvia sifts through the ash layer, a picture of a great destructive event emerges. Among the ruins, they find a large 180 kilogram saddle quern that workers used to grind grain.
That's called a saddle quern because you basically would straddle it like you were riding a horse, and then you would run your grinder back and forth like this to grind the grain.
But for Dr. Sylvia, the position of the saddle quern doesn't make any sense.
It was literally blown off of its dirt pedestal onto its side on the ground in a northeasterly direction.
The team are intrigued by how such a large, heavy object could have been blown over. And it's not the only object. Across the site, they uncover artifacts and structures that landed in the same direction, seemingly pushed by some catastrophic force.
You find bits and pieces of pottery, everything you can imagine, strewn for 6, 7, 8 meters across the floor to the northeast. So everything has this directionality to it. Everything inside there is churned up and full of ash and pottery and broken mud bricks, and everything about it is catastrophic.
The team has uncovered evidence of a great destructive event hitting Tal el-Hammam. Dr. Collins calls it the Middle Bronze Destruction Event. What could have caused it? In 2011, the team make a chilling find.
We started finding human bones, piece of a pelvis, piece of a knee bone, piece of a femur. One of them was only existing from the mid-femur down. Everything else is missing. And the place where the separation occurred is severely burned. It's almost like they were burned off.
They appear to have been bodily slammed up against one of the very thick walls and then fell to the ground and were covered in ash and in material there.
These were not lovingly placed burials. These were people who wound up in these positions by some sort of violent event.
In another section, they find further evidence that the inhabitants were killed by an intense force.
In the Middle Bronze Palace area, 2 skulls emerged. We have no lower jaw bones on either one. One, we have the entire skull, and it is smashed down. One has a piece of pelvis right here next to the fragments of the skull. They are literally blown to bits.
For Collins, the location of the skulls is key.
We are 8 meters down and 1 meter deep in the destruction matrix. There is no doubt, 0 doubt, that these 2 individuals, these 2 skulls fragments, belong to the Middle Bronze destruction event itself.
The body is just not designed to stand up to that kind of force. And it's both shocking, it's both traumatizing, but on the other hand, as an engineer, as a scientist, it's absolutely fascinating.
The team believes they are getting closer to discovering what destroyed this city. But so far, nothing conclusive, which tells them this might be biblical Sodom. But the more they excavate, the clearer it becomes that they're dealing with a monumental site. Along the outside of the city, they uncover the foundations of a much larger structure, a 3-meter thick wall.
I asked them to dig a bit further to the east, and there they found the beginning of another wall coming out. Same type of bricks. And as the other one was 3 meters wide, I kind of paced it out. But then it clicked to me, because here a massive tower extending out from the city wall.
Dr. Rittmeyer and the team have just come across the ruins of a colossal gateway complex, 21 meters wide and 14 meters high, with towers on either side and up to 6 chambers. The Tal el-Hammam team are gradually unearthing the secrets of a vast metropolis spanning an area approximately 150 acres, with an estimated population of up to 65,000 inhabitants.
It had all the features of a major city center. I mean, with its palaces, its temples, its residential areas, its streets, its massive fortifications, its satellite towns, its massive agricultural areas that it could take advantage of. It had everything to make it great. And this is what the Bible describes, and this is what the archaeology confirms.
It fits the geographical clues in terms of location. It fits the time frame in terms of its occupation history. To me, I don't see what other conclusion you can come to.
But if they want to convince the wider community that Tal el-Hammam is biblical Sodom, then their work is far from over.
I have to say, the site is really interesting. It's the interpretation of the site that I find problematic. So much more work needs to be done before we can understand the site in context and its importance, but also what destroyed it.
Whether or not Tal el-Hammam is Sodom remains to be seen. But what's clear from the team's findings is there once existed a large and thriving civilization in this area.
In Tal el-Hammam, we got a very definite layout of the city. There you got a lower city and upper city. The lower city were the common people, near the upper city, which had its own separate defense system. It was a totally secluded area used by the king to have his palace and his royal officials.
Artifacts found throughout Tal el-Hammam have helped the team decipher how people lived during this time.
Most of the houses are mud brick houses. And the houses themselves were often multi-generational houses. So you got quite a few rooms built around a central courtyard. Then you've had an awning overhead, and that's where they baked the bread, where they roasted their chickens or whatever they were eating, and the women used to grind their flour. All that took place in that courtyard. That was kind of the life of the house.
I mean, we have a city that lasts for 3,000 years without a hiccup. Things are pretty much operating like a well-oiled machine.
But then, according to the evidence, somewhere around 1700 BCE, during the Middle Bronze Age, the city of Tal el-Hammam was violently destroyed. What was behind its catastrophic demise? Could the answer provide a clue as to whether this is the original city of sin? At the site, archaeologists have found evidence of scorched walls and floors buried beneath piles of ash, burned pottery sherds, as well as charred human remains they believe were blown around by some concussive force. For them, the evidence matches the biblical account of fire and brimstone destroying Sodom. But what could cause this?
If you're looking at evidence from Tal el-Hammam, it's reasonable to wonder whether this is a consequence of a huge volcanic event.
Was Tal el-Hammam destroyed by a volcano? In recent decades, experts have found evidence of a volcanic flow of ancient lava in the hills northeast of the Dead Sea, whilst 1/6 of Jordan is covered in hardened lava, known as basalt.
There's lots and lots of basalt rock around that part of the Dead Sea. That's because that area is very geologically active. It's had volcanism throughout much of its history.
But there's a problem with the theory. There's no volcano close to the site of Tal el-Hammam.
To get volcanic activity, you don't need to have a kind of triangular volcanic mountain spewing out of lots of lava, or even a dormant volcano. What you need is a heat source underneath the surface with molten rock, and you need pathways to the surface by which that heat can get out. And that's what we call a volcanic system. So you can have volcanic systems that are not invisible, but they're pretty hard to detect.
Despite evidence of ancient lava flow in this region, many reject the idea that this is responsible for the destruction of the site.
There's just not enough of the material. You know, you need a really significant amount of ash to really cause the abandonment of a city. And from what we can see, there just doesn't seem to be enough.
But there is another natural event that could be to blame.
Now, if somebody told me, okay, I've got the city ruins and they've been collapsed, obviously the buildings have toppled down and there's lots of evidence of fire happening, I'd have probably gone, I'll tell you what, that sounds to me like it was probably an earthquake.
So what happens to tectonic plates during an earthquake is that you've got these two plates and they're moving, but at the boundary between the two of them, they're stuck, they're snagged, there's friction, and the stress builds up. And it builds up and builds up until at some point it can't take it any longer, and then it just moves, it displaces. And that generates a whole lot of energy, a whole lot of frictional heat and noise, and that's the seismic waves that go. And that, essentially, is the earthquake.
Could an earthquake have made the ground drastically shift and caused the collapse of Tal el-Hammam?
So when the fault line moves, it can move vertically, or it can move horizontally, or it can move a combination of the two. And in the Dead Sea, rift zone, it tends to be a combination of the two.
That's what shook the buildings, caused them to collapse, and maybe set off a chain reaction of fire. Maybe a kiln was gone and the rest of the roofs and the city burnt, and that's what had happened.
But for the Tal el-Hammam team, the evidence they found at the site suggests an earthquake can't be to blame.
When you get an earthquake, the ground moves back and forth. We are in a north-south strike-slip zone in the region around Tal el-Hammam. So when you have earthquakes there, things tend to move north and south. And so walls tend to fall in both directions. But all of the material evidence we're finding is pushed to the northeast. and only to the northeast. It's very monodirectional.
Crucially, the team make another discovery which suggests that the site remained unoccupied for approximately 700 years during the late Bronze Age period.
Well, in that region, one of our primary means of telling time is through pottery evidence. We just do not have pottery in the region that covers the entire late Bronze period. There's virtually none. And the second thing that you would look for is there any architecture? Now, there was a brief single building that we believe was a toll house or a way station during that period that lasted maybe a decade or two. So between the pottery, between the architecture, nobody was home. They just migrated through.
The team have uncovered evidence of a thriving Middle Bronze Age city, destroyed by a violent event, followed by a 700-year period where the site remained largely abandoned. For them, the location of Tal el-Hammam and its scale indicates it could be Sodom. But they're no closer to explaining the cause for its catastrophic demise. Then, in 2011, whilst excavating a section of the upper city, Dr. Collins's team make an extraordinary discovery.
When the excavators of that square called me over, they said, "You have to come and look at this."
They found a piece of pottery in the Middle Bronze Age layer. Thousands are scattered throughout the site, but this piece is different. On one side, the fragment looks like regular Bronze Age pottery, but on the other, the surface is green and glass-like.
It looks like one side of it is superficially melted. It's just lapping over the edge ever so slightly.
For Dr. Collins, it looks like a piece of glazed Islamic pottery. But this form of pottery wasn't produced until thousands of years after the destruction of Tal el-Hammam. Collins is intrigued by the find. The fragment looks as though it's time-traveled from a later era.
What in the world is a piece of glazed pottery doing down here this deep?
Could it offer any clues for the cause of Tal el-Hammam's destruction? Collins takes the strange-looking piece of pottery for analysis at the US Geological Survey Laboratory in New Mexico. When the results come back, they are quite literally out of this world.
We know that now from the tests. Everything about this particular melted surface of pottery sherd is physically identical to trinitite.
The word trinitite comes from the codename Trinity, used in the first ever detonation of a nuclear bomb. The test took place on the 16th of July, 1945, in the Jornada del Muerto Desert, New Mexico.
When the Trinity bomb was detonated, it released the equivalent of 21,000 tons of TNT. That's actually slightly more than the nuclear bomb they dropped in Hiroshima in World War II.
In the aftermath of the explosion, scientists noticed a strange substance all across the surface of the desert.
When the bomb exploded, it sends out a big fireball, and that creates a huge mushroom cloud, a big uprush, and it took a whole load of the sand up in there, and that basically melted because of the immense heat, and then rained back down onto the desert, which cooled really quickly and then formed this glassy trinitite.
The melted glass-like surface of the sand is similar to that found on the pottery sherd at Tal el-Hammam. When it's analyzed further, experts discover something else: zircon.
Zircon's a naturally occurring mineral that you can find in rocks pretty much all over the world. Looking at zircon under a microscope, what you'll see is like a crystal-like structure, and very, very regular with very sharp, jagged edges, basically.
But the zircon inside this piece of pottery is different.
This zircon was actually a lot smoother, kind of more like a teardrop.
Experts conclude that the zircon in this fragment must have undergone an extreme process to create such a strange shape.
It suggests that this zircon had been heated up to a really high temperature, such that it even melted, and then it had cooled very quickly. Because otherwise you'd get, the more regular looking zircon that usually takes, thousands of years to cool down.
The fragment must have been subjected to extreme heat for it to have melted this way.
A normal fire will burn at somewhere between 600 and 2,000 degrees Celsius. For zircon to melt, though, you're talking at least 4,000 degrees Celsius there. That's over double the hottest fires.
Now, the surface of the sun is about 4,000 degrees. So you're talking about temperatures equivalent to the surface of the sun.
And as the excavation continues, the team unearth more and more pieces of extreme heat-blasted pottery.
Every place we've excavated across the site, we have found indicators of these high heat events. Every place we find bits and pieces. What kind of thing could do that?
From the evidence at this ancient site, we know there must have been incredible temperatures, much hotter than a regular fire. And it created a substance very similar to trinitite, but of course, there weren't nuclear bombs back then. So what could have caused this? Well, one possible option is a meteor.
Now, at our site, there is no crater on the ground for us to point to and look at and say, aha, here's the conclusive evidence that we have some kind of astral body coming in and hitting us. We don't have that.
But meteors don't need to make impact to unleash their destructive power on Earth. An incredible concussive force and a blast of high-intensity heat can result from a rare cosmic phenomenon known as a meteor airburst.
An airburst can be when a meteor in the Earth's atmosphere explodes in the air before it's hit the ground.
The damage on the ground from the explosion can be devastating.
Firstly, you've got this really hot rock, the meteor, in the air that's radiating heat that can set things ablaze. Now, when it explodes, you've got the big shock wave. That can also take temperature with it, so you can feel a heat rush. The amount of devastation you're going to see really depends on the size of the rock. Bigger meteor, more destruction.
Meteor airbursts are rare, but they have occurred in recent history. In 1908, in a remote uninhabited region of Siberia, an airburst is believed to have wiped out an area larger than Los Angeles.
An eyewitness described the sky appearing to split in two and being covered with fire. It destroyed about 80 million trees. In the nearest town, about 60 kilometers away, residents could feel the heat of the blast. Windows smashed in the buildings, and some people were even knocked off their feet because of the force of the airburst strike. It would have felt like the end of days.
More recently, in 2013, cameras caught the moment an airburst exploded over the city of Chelyabinsk in southern Russia. 1,500 people suffered injuries, and thousands of buildings were damaged. The team at el-Hammam believe that the evidence they found points to an airburst, which left a path of utter destruction in its wake.
What we're looking at is a very large site that was literally the buildings blown off of their foundations. Artifacts, the pottery, the tools that they were using are shattered. And this basically vaporizes and incinerates everything in its path. And what we see is that all of that ash and all of that material is blown into a northeasterly direction. The only known source of the kind of concussive profile that we're seeing in the evidence, of the kind of thermal profile that we're seeing, is a meteoritic airburst.
As for the 700-year gap in habitation at Tal el-Hammam, Dr. Sylvia believes this is a direct result of the airburst as it explodes over the Dead Sea, just 13 kilometers away.
If you have an airburst event over water, it will actually produce a tsunami effect where a wave will be pushed across the landscape. You have a very high volume of now superheated brine spray of Dead Sea water that's traveling with the blast front. Well, that 700-year gap, I believe, is best explained by the poisoning of the soil with Dead Sea water that left behind a very high salt concentration.
It's possible the high salt content of the Dead Sea water would have rendered the land infertile for a number of centuries.
It was impossible to grow any cereal grains. And if you can't grow cereal grains, you can't support cattle, you can't support people, you just cannot support a civilization moving back into the area.
The science is clear, the analysis is clear, and the evidence is mounting. I'm not saying that we absolutely have it nailed down yet, but we know that all the indicators that we have are consistent with an airburst.
For the archaeologists, the destruction of Tal el-Hammam by meteor airburst provides a striking match to the biblical destruction of Sodom. Fire and brimstone rained from above, destroying the city and its people, and leaving the surrounding region uninhabitable. But not everyone is convinced.
A meteoritic event is very rare. They do happen, but they're very rare. I think before you can jump to conclusions and people can start suggesting that, you need more evidence. And I think actually an event like that would have a signature much wider and in the environmental record. So we need to look there.
Since 2005, Dr. Collins and his team have excavated at Tal el-Hammam. They've made a truly astonishing find: the remains of a thriving vast metropolis northeast of the Dead Sea, which they believe matches the biblical description of Sodom. Crucially for Collins, their discovery and analysis of Tal el-Hammam's destruction provides a close match to the biblical account of the destruction of Sodom.
People often ask me how certain I am that Tal el-Hammam is Sodom. It's become very certain to me that there's no other possibility. It's in the right place, it is in exactly the right time frame, it has the right stuff, it has the right destruction event.
When Steve Collins first asked me to come to the dig and he said that he thought that this may be Sodom, I was very skeptical. I believe the Bible, I take the text serious, but I don't dig with the Bible in my hand, as it were. The size, the location, the way Sodom was destroyed, and my own reading again the original text make me now convinced that Tal el-Hammam is Sodom.
But the team still face scrutiny from the wider archaeological community.
We know that meteorites strike the Earth. So is this possible? Sure. Is this also a pretty speculative reaching for a possible explanation that kind of matches the story in the Bible to explain the destruction of what you want to be Sodom? Yeah, it looks like that as well.
Cynics might suggest that the airburst theory for the destruction of Tal el-Hammam is just too spectacular, too kind of space age. But just because it's a 1 in a million chance doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
The team continues to dig for evidence. To answer the question beyond doubt of whether Tal el-Hammam really is the city of Sodom.